a matter of housekeeping before I bring up the PowerPoint. I will possibly not be available on the 21st. We'll see. So not sure if I'm able to do a class day or not yet. So that's kind of, you might put an asterisk on that day. That's Thanksgiving week. And so I probably will be okay to do it. But what I want to do is to cover 3 lessons every 2 weeks, kind of going forward. But that, unless we get into a really doozy of a lesson, in which we'll cover only 1. And that'll get us done maybe mid-December, one way or another. And we'll skip in the holidays at the end, and possibly the Tuesday of Thanksgiving week. So just put an asterisk on that one for now. And we'll see if we can get to that. I'm going to bring up the PowerPoint today, the first one at least. Okay, we're going to begin talking about the Restoration movement in America. I say the Restoration movement. You could argue that there are multiple movements and even 2 streams in the early 1800s that came together, where you had churches that were reflective of one movement and churches that were reflective of another movement beginning to overlap and then merging eventually. And so, more apropos to our own history, if you will, and where did the churches of Christ in the United States of America come from? And it's not an apostolic succession thing where you can trace your history all the way back to the apostles. Obviously, it's something where instead of succession or tradition, it's identity. You plant the same seed with the same biological potential and the DNA, and you get the same crop. And you get a New Testament Christian if you plant the incorruptible word that produces New Testament Christians. And so there was this giant movement that really began in this country in the 1700s, but really takes off in the early 1800s. And so we'll talk about the first half of the 19th century, first half of the 1800s in today's session, and then start the second half of that century, and then finish the second half of that century next week, Lord willing, and then get into the early 20th century. So these are things that I think that every preacher should know, that if you're going to preach to people in this country, especially because you're going to get pigeonholed sometimes unfairly, and other times it's just helpful to know where things have been and why things are the way they are right now. So with all of that in mind, the Restoration movement in this country, there were precursor movements. We talked about some of those in the Middle Ages and beyond, all the way down into England with John Wycliffe and the Lollards and William Tyndale and others that came before them in the Middle Ages. But precursor movements, you have definitely in the 1600s, Churches of Christ in England. You have multiple Churches of Christ. Many of them eventually morph into Baptist churches. And a really good book where you've got kind of a broad view of this, even though he's not the best writer in the world, is Keith Sisman's book, Traces of the Kingdom. But he traces a lot of these things and goes back into original source material, much of which I have in my library. And so at Tottled Bank, for instance, near Greenodd, Ulverston, Lancashire, England, you have an old church building, and there's a minute book dating from the 1600s of a Church of Christ. In fact, I have minutes of churches of Christ or a Church of Christ in England, records of it that have been preserved in my library. Being nonconformist, the minister was allowed in town only if he swore not to undermine the established Anglican Church. And in the Fairness District of Lancashire in northwest England, 1669, a group of 8 churches of Christ. And an old minute book has been found in the year 1669. It shows that they called themselves by the name of Church of Christ, practiced baptism by immersion, celebrated the Lord's Supper each Lord's Day, had elders and deacons, and very interesting stuff. When you read a book produced in 1645, the Dippers dipped, or the Anabaptists ducked and plunged over head and ears, you have a debate between the Anglican scholar and one of the King James Version translators, Daniel Featley, against preachers from churches of Christ on the question of adult believers' baptism versus infant baptism that Dr. Featley favored. And interesting debate. I used to have an original of this. I sold it this last year, and I still have a copy. You have a photograph of a little chapel. This is one of Keith Sisman's photos. He was also a photographer in addition to being a preacher. Died of a heart attack a couple of years back. But anyway, a photograph of the little chapel that sits on the bridge in St. Ives, Cambridgeshire, England. And where in the 1650s, for a few months, the Church of Christ met before moving to a house nearby. And interesting that they met in the little chapel on the bridge. But the preacher Henry Dinn, who was well known in churches of Christ at the time in the 1600s, was imprisoned twice for baptizing by immersion believers for remission of their sins. Later, his son John Dinn, continued to work with that church and their elders. And as you get into the 1700s, very famous name that comes up in Restoration Circle talk is John Glass, minister of the Congregational Church, but very much so a restorationist. His tombstone says that he died 2nd of November, 1773, aged 78 years. He long survived Catherine Black, his beloved wife, interred also in the same grave, and all his children, 15 in number, many of whom arrived at mature age, and 9 lie here beside their parents. His character in the churches of Christ is well known and will outlive all monumental descriptions. Not only is he a nonconformist, a separatist, but had many restorationist ideas that influenced, in turn, people like Thomas Campbell, Alexander Campbell, who came from Scotland to the New World. And from a Glassite account, after John Glass's name, you have this account in 1832. We think ourselves bound to follow the practices of the primitive disciples and churches as far as we can learn from the New Testament how they walked, while the apostles were with them, beholding their order and steadfastness in the faith. They were definitely trying to replicate New Testament Christianity. You have other restoration-minded leaders in Scotland, Robert Sandeman. Ed Harrell has alluded to him a lot in his writings, but he was the son-in-law of John Glass, and Robert Haldane and James Haldane in Scotland, all the way into the early 1800s. Very much restoration-minded New Testament Christians for all intents and purposes. These men in turn would influence Thomas and Alexander Campbell, who would then move to the New World from the British Isles. So you have the restoration spirit that catches on early on in the United States of America. Obviously, much of the nation was founded on people who subscribed to a Judeo-Christian ethic and were very serious about the Bible and religious liberty. Prominent voices among early restorationists in America, among Methodists, James O'Kelly; among Baptists, Abner Jones and Elias Smith; among Presbyterians, Barton W. Stone. Underscore that name, very important, very influential at least. And then from Presbyterian and later Baptist roots, Alexander Campbell and his father, Thomas Campbell. And so you have in 1801, very prominent church meeting on near Lexington, Kentucky, the Cane Ridge Revival. And one writer has gone so far as to call it America's Pentecost. And Barton W. Stone was one of the organizers. People were caught up in evangelistic fervor and in some cases behaved themselves like modern Pentecostals, but nonetheless, there was a great outpouring of religious revivalism. You have this sometimes being referred to as kind of a second Great Awakening after the original Great Awakening in colonial New England. But you have Alexander Campbell in what we would call West Virginia, Barton W. Stone, and a number of others on the evangelistic frontier, or the frontier of the country, places like Missouri, Kentucky, et cetera, ultimately coming together. And the idea was that you have a divisive Christendom, and by this point, you have a great enlightenment and an application of logical principles of common sense, including a basic hermeneutic of how to interpret the Bible and to engage with it. And so the desire is to get away from denominationalism and get back to the purity of New Testament Christianity. Denominationalism, or Protestant denominationalism, by the early 1800s is almost 300 years old. And you have divisiveness, you have different creeds, different statements, different hierarchies, different denominational bodies, and fighting like cats and dogs. And so you have Alexander and his father, Thomas Campbell, coming along, as well as Barton W. Stone out west, basically wanting to unite Christians on the basis of truth. And we speak where the Bible speaks. We are silent where the Bible is silent. You have some slogans like that begin to manifest themselves. And so you have these two large reforming streams, or restorationist streams, if you will, recognizing a common cause as, again, churches began to bump into each other from both streams, Alexander Campbell and the Disciples of Christ, and those affiliated with Barton Stone and other preachers that he worked with would either call themselves Christian churches or churches of Christ. And so eventually you have basically a recognition that we largely think alike. And so instead of two separate movements, you have churches beginning to unite all over the country from these two streams. And from the 1830s on, you have churches of Christ. Sometimes they were called Disciples of Christ. In a few instances, at least Christian churches, and interchangeable names being used, but this desire to get back to the Bible. And my favorite character early on here is definitely Barton W. Stone. He was rather poor. He was a frontiersman. He was humble. Alexander Campbell, by contrast, was very educated, very eloquent, and very rich. And just in reading about both men, they're both good men in many respects, but I'm just struck by the humility of Barton W. Stone more so than Alexander Campbell. He was a Presbyterian clergyman in southern Kentucky. Again, this Cane Ridge revival takes place in 1801. He is expelled along with some others from the Synod of Kentucky Presbyterian in 1803. He and his fellows form a Springfield Presbytery to get back to closer to New Testament Christianity. And then shortly thereafter, they put that presbytery to death. and they do so with a document they all signed called the Last Will and Testament of the Springfield Presbytery. And so from that moment going forward, they're going to really make an all-out attempt to replicate New Testament Christianity and get away not only from the Presbyterian Church, but from all denominationalism. And so the movement catches fire on the American frontier, and you have churches popping up everywhere. You have camp meetings, you have revivals, you have gospel meetings, just everywhere. And people didn't have TV or radio or internet, or and so when these circuit rider preachers would come through, or you would have these lengthy revival meetings that would take place. You would have massive numbers of people baptized into Christ, and churches forming in these new areas on the frontier, and this whole movement just catches fire. You have a number of Americans that really want to get back to the Bible. The King James has caught on here more than in England by that point. And then on the other hand, you have Thomas and Alexander Campbell that arrive from Northern Ireland and have some Scottish connections as well. But Presbyterian minister arrives in the U.S. and comes up with this slogan, where the scriptures speak, we speak; where the scriptures are silent, we are silent. He forms this document called the Declaration and Address in 1809, outlining steps for a return to the restoration of primitive Christianity. And then that really Alexander Campbell overshadows his father eventually, and Presbyterian at first, then Baptist, and so he writes a Baptist paper in a Christian Baptist, it was called, in the 1830s, and then eventually the Millennial Harbinger. These guys were post-millennialists, and I won't get into all that right now, but they believed that eventually things would get better, and this movement would transform all of America and then all over the world. People would come into Christ Jesus, and there would be something of a growing utopia of New Testament Christianity on the earth. Didn't play out the way they thought, and I disagree with a lot of their post-millennialism, but nonetheless, Millennial Harbinger was the name of his most famous paper. He founded Bethany College in Bethany, Virginia, and eventually that chunk of Virginia became West Virginia after the Civil War. And he arguably died the richest man in West Virginia. So very influential, a man that had a lot of connections in Washington, D.C., and people in high places, a man who was well respected in the Eastern Seaboard and into the frontier portion of the country. One of the men who worked closely with him was Walter Scott, who died in 1861. He came up with this 5-finger exercise in the Western Reserve States in 1827. And the original 5-finger exercise that he came up with to simplify the gospel was belief, repentance, immersion, forgiveness, and gift of the Holy Spirit. Somehow over the years, that got morphed to hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. And preachers took off with that, but they continued that 5-finger exercise. And but he is the one that kind of got that going in the United States as simplifying the gospel. Raccoon John Smith, another frontier preacher connected with Alexander Campbell and others that were in that portion of the movement, and dies in 1868 after the Civil War ends. And then you have this rapid growth. Again, these two streams tend to coalesce in the 1830s, and by 1850, after about only 20 years of an independent existence, you have Disciples of Christ, or Churches of Christ, are one of the the leading religious movements in the United States. They go from 0 to 118,000. And you see Methodist are number one, Baptist number two. This is in 1850. And so very rapidly growing. And then by 1865, they double again. 15 years later into the post-Civil War era. And the movement claimed over 200,000. And then 4 decades later, there was a famous religious census, 1906. You have over 1 million. So it multiplied by 5 times or so in the 4 decades that followed. We're talking massive amounts of growth at a time when America was much smaller than it is now. So as the movement grew, tensions emerged. You have a lot of the preachers preaching that biblical silence is prohibitive. It's a red light instead of a green light. They're wanting to unify Christians everywhere on the basis of truth. But ultimately, as you have some beginnings of fragmentation and different thought processes in the movement, you have divisions as to what is more important, unity or truth. Do we promote unity at the expense of truth, or do we promote truth at the possible expense of unity? And they wanted both and began this movement on the basis of both. We'll unify Christians everywhere on the basis of truth. And in matters that are essential, we will have unity. In matters of indifference, we will have unity based on truth, but in matters of indifference or matters of liberty, we'll have unity, and we will basically respect each other's consciences. But then you have issues that begin to pop up that really challenge that slogan, that desire that builds up the movement initially. And for instance, 2 issues that really begin to threaten the unity of the disciples as you get into the second half of the 1800s. One initially is the American Christian Missionary Society. We'll begin talking about that time permitting here. And then the second one is instrumental music. And I think we have time to get into that a little bit. But one of the issues that comes up is that you have a lot of missionary societies popping up among the denominations by the mid 1800s. And so here you have this fast growing movement that is trying to replicate New Testament Christianity. And they're looking at their denominational friends who are developing all these missionary societies. And the idea begins to be put forward that we could do a lot better evangelistic work on the frontier and overseas if we would pool together the resources of congregations all across the board in a central bureaucratic apparatus. And so if we have ourselves a missionary society, we can match this good work that these denominations are doing. And in 1849, Alexander Campbell became the first president of the American Christian Missionary Society. And initially there was a lot of euphoria for it, and then people began to take a step back and question it. By far and away, because Alexander Campbell was on board and you had a number of the leaders of the movement on board, you have dissenters in the minority. raising questions and beginning to speak out against it in the years following. And then when instrumental music hit, it also was introduced near Lexington, Kentucky. So, at least in the Churches of Christ. And it began to take off because, again, prior to the mid 19th century, almost none of the denominations were using instrumental music. And here they were all adopting it. And then you have these churches jumping on the same bandwagon, just like with the Missionary Society concept. And so these two issues become lightning rods as the movement has grown by leaps and bounds, but begins to give way to internal fissures and ruptures in the second half of the 1800s. So I think that's pretty much all of this lesson, but a couple of questions just to consider. I'll read them. We won't necessarily answer them. Did the American Restoration movement produce a denomination? It was obviously viewed that way by other people outside the movement. By people inside the movement, they were simply trying to replicate New Testament Christianity with independent local congregations and without a central denominational headquarters or human institution to have to produce a federation of churches or a sisterhood of churches with a headquarters here upon the earth. And so there was a lot of independence in the local churches as well as individual conscience among Christians. But the introduction of that 1849 American Christian Missionary Society really, I think, dealt a huge blow to the idea that this is not headed toward a potential denomination. And it introduces a form of denominational machinery that heretofore did not exist in the movement. Should the forebears of the movement be idolized? I know some preachers who practically put Alexander Campbell, Thomas Campbell, Barton Stone on a pedestal and revere them to such an extent that almost anything that they say is worth their weight in gold. And I don't feel the same way. I believe they were really good men and did a lot of good things. But as I read their writings, I do occasionally disagree. And should the history of the movement be totally ignored? No, I don't think so. But by the same token, it should not be revered as a rallying point for mindless tradition. I don't even pretend to regurgitate whatever Alexander Campbell or Barton Stone thought. But by the same token, one thing that they both promoted that I do subscribe to is the effort to get back to New Testament Christianity. And I believe they achieved that to a large extent, maybe not perfectly, but in the striving of launching this effort to get back to the Bible, I hold that same desire to get back to the Bible. What, if anything, is the enduring value of the movement? I think that is it. The all-out desire to get back to the purity of New Testament Christianity. So what can we learn from those in the past who have attempted this? When you read what happens, and there are a lot of books that you can look at. I've recommended some privately to Reagan and to Caleb. You're reading about their humble attempts to do what we're also trying to do. And they have successes, they have failures, they run into roadblocks, they have hiccups, they have areas where they have a potential stumbling block that has to be overcome. And all of that is true to human nature, and there's really a lot that they had to grapple with that we also have to grapple with. And so it's not only interesting, but it's instructive to go back and see how they dealt with some of those issues. And not that they dealt with them perfectly, and not to idolize the way that they dealt with them. But there's just a lot to learn there in terms of, okay, they had that problem too. And so, and we can go back and we can learn a lot from how they dealt with some of these things. And then I think I have one more page here. No, that's it. So I'll stop that PowerPoint. And are there questions or comments or anything that anyone would like to add to that one? I'm going to bring up a second PowerPoint here in a minute, but anything, has anybody really studied that period that you might like to share something with the rest of us that strikes you, or do you have any questions about that first half of the 1800s, let's say?
Mike, one of the things that's interesting to me is that I've studied, at least, is there's a lot of pockets of people who didn't know Alexander Campbell, didn't know Barton Stone, and started baptizing in immersion for the remission of sins. You know, like you have all these pockets, and there's some in Alabama, and that's what I'm more familiar with, what I've studied most, because that's where a lot of my time has been. But it's just interesting to see that this idea or concept is not, like you pointed that out, you know, we're just trying to go back to scripture. Well, we're not alone in that. You pointed that out earlier, like in England, you know, back before, there's a lot of those connections to that. So I find that kind of, it's helpful to know, like, it's not one or two people that I'm just trying to go back to the Bible. And there are lots of evidence for other people that have done that along the way.
Yeah. And the really fascinating thing to me is that continues. Not, you know, I have bumped into people, even in this country, that don't know anything about us, and they're trying to do that. And I have heard stories of preachers bumping into people in Siberia who are essentially New Testament Christians and just reading and putting into practice the Bible. Rick Lanning went to China and ran into people in a village, and they wanted him to present the gospel. He did, and basically they said, you know, we've already done that. And and the more he would question them, the more they'd already done what he thought should be done by a New Testament Christian. And so here, out of the middle of nowhere in a foreign country, he's bumping into New Testament Christians. I just got a text last night from Don Houghton, who just came back from a small country in Africa, and he's been working in this country. And here you have some people who were close, but not maybe completely there on a few issues. And now they've begun appointing a plurality of elders rather than just one. And they've begun partaking of the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day instead of more infrequently. And but they were already, you know, maybe 75, 90% there already. And so and it's refreshing when you're running into people that have that mindset, even if they're not there. I would even say that we have a ways to go sometimes, and I know I do. And so we're all a work in progress in that sense. There's always going to be a gap between the way things are and the way things ought to be, and our job is to span that gap. So whether it's in terms of our individual practice as Christians or our collective practice as a congregation, in replicating what you see in the New Testament for those things. And it's exciting when you're able to link up with people of like mind who have the same desire. And so that's what happens on a broad scale in the early 1800s in the United States of America. And I think in the centuries preceding it, you have the soil being prepared for that. And so when people come over here and they have this firm, all-out desire to know the Bible and to implement the Bible, then the movement just takes off because you have a whole bunch of people that have that mindset and they want to get it right. And then when these preachers come around and they hold these camp meetings and so on, then this thing just catches fire. And it's a beautiful thing that occurred. Other comments, questions?
Hey, Mike. I'm sorry if it's kind of loud out here, but I just want to make a quick comment going back to what you guys were saying. It's funny because when I was still in the Mormon church, one of those dominoes that fell that was breaking my testimony when I was in the Mormon church is actually a friend who I would say today, he's still a great friend. He is one of the most restorationist people I've ever met. It's funny because I found later the Church of Christ, and I've taken him to my church, but he's still so radical in the restoration where he doesn't want to even meet in buildings. But anyways, that's not the point. The point is I was so happy to find him as a friend because he definitely helped guide me in the right direction, I would say, even leaving out of Mormonism. Thank you.
Okay, good. I mean, there are people out there. I sometimes tell the story when I was a young preacher about Reagan's age or Caleb's age. I was preaching down in Southern California in a little town called Indio near Palm Springs. And I was at the church office one day, and this lady calls, and she'd been a Christian Scientist almost all her life, but she'd been reading the Bible on her own. And she said, I've been reading the Bible. I've never been baptized, and I want to be immersed in water into Christ's church. And I've come to those conclusions. She said, I want to be immersed. I don't want any of this sprinkling business. I want to be immersed in water. I don't want any of this Holy Spirit baptism business. I want to be immersed in water into Christ's church. I don't want to be baptized into a denomination. I want to be immersed in water into Christ's church. And then she asked, can you do that for me? I just about fell off my chair. But it restored my confidence that people could pick up a Bible and come to that conclusion. And that's encouraging. And so, and it happens, and it still happens. And so it happened on a wide scale here in the early 1800s of the United States of America. Okay, so we'll start the next lesson and maybe do half of it, and then look at the second half of this next lesson next time, and then the lesson after that, because I'm trying to kill 3 birds with 2 stones here. Do 3 lessons over a course of 2 weeks, the next few times, and so bear with me while I shut down this PowerPoint and bring in the next one. And so hold on just a second. All right, so okay, so what happens at the beginning of the 1800s in this movement is extremely exciting, and they're growing by leaps and bounds, and they're multiplying, and this thing is just caught wildfire. And then you have this American Christian Missionary Society, 1849. You have the instrumental music issue that really begins exploding toward the end of the 19th century. And then you have the Civil War. The Civil War often would divide folks in the northern part of the country and the southern part of the country. And the Northerners tended to be wealthier, more prosperous. They were victorious in the war. The Southerners tended to be poorer after the war, especially. And you have some people in the North that want, because they're into the second, third, fourth generation of this movement, they want a more sophisticated type of church life. And those people in the South tended to want just the basic New Testament Christianity, something that was simpler and more reflective of primitive Christianity. And so you have this fissure that takes place. You have again, buildings begin to pop up everywhere, and people are going to church, and you have these churches of Christ or disciples of Christ. And the Restoration movement grows strong and influential. By the mid 1800s, rival groups began to view it as a denomination, even though the folks in the movement did not see it as such. In spite of attempts to escape from denominationalism and promote a simple New Testament pattern. Internally, you have a sophisticated upper class of members, particularly in the post-Civil War North, and they began to crave a worldly respectability. If that's true of the American Christian Missionary Society and Instruments of Music, you just imagine the other things that began to be desired as a reflection of what other groups were doing, and the worldliness that is reflective of that. So you have a movement come of age. And even though each local church was independent, the American Christian Missionary Society started organizing mission work under one human umbrella, just as denominations were doing. And just as instrumental music in worship began to appear in denominations about the same time, the trend infiltrated the Restoration churches. And again, these two issues became lightning rods for internal divisions in the movement. So more conservative voices became alarmed, and there was an attempt to mute them. In fact, they were sometimes referred to in later 1800s periods as being anti, because they were against the progressive spirit of the time. So you have disturbing trends that begin to really appear after the war ends. And some of the things that I've read is you not only have the Missionary Society and instrumental music, but you have a trend toward denominational thinking, a trend toward fashionable buildings, a trend in preaching on broader unity and against biblical authority, emphasize love and don't emphasize these doctrinal divisions so much, and a trend toward exalting preachers. You have preachers in the movement beginning to call themselves reverend and appreciating it when others called them that. And so Moses Lard, who tended to be more conservative on instrumental music, but more liberal on the Missionary Society question, saw that there were some internal fissures in the movement, different kinds of thinking, and he wrote an article, famous article, called "Can We Divide?" And his initial answer is no, we can't divide because we're not a denomination. We are a movement of independent local churches, and unlike Protestant groups, nearly every one of which divided along sectional lines during the war, there was naive optimism here. New Testament teaching condemned division. And again, they're in a unity movement based on truth. And so unity is very important to them. And there's no ecclesiastical hierarchy to declare a division. Churches were local and autonomous. And yet, by the 1870s, you see churches splitting over these lightning rod issues. And so Lard said, the prudent man watches well the first symptoms of disease. He is a poor observer of men and things, who does not see slowly growing up among us a class of men who can no longer be satisfied with the ancient gospel and the ancient order of things. These men must have changes, and silently they are preparing the mind of the brotherhood to receive changes. So even though he was optimistic that we're not going to have some major division, but we do have to address this growing issue, this growing problem of influential preachers who are beginning to inculcate some attitude differences, and we need to address that or else. And so, and he saw that in 1865. So you have a lot of key players in the South in particular. You have men who wanted to toe the line and stick to their guns with the ancient gospel. Tolbert Fanning was very famous. He opposed the Missionary Society and instrumental music, began the paper Gospel Advocate. He was a mentor to David Lipscomb, and David Lipscomb himself worked with Tolbert Fanning on the Gospel Advocate, founded a little institution called the Nashville Bible School. It's now called Lipscomb University. He opposed missionary societies and instrumental music. You have one of the few northern influential preachers. He was extremely influential. He was named after the founding father, Benjamin Franklin. But this is Benjamin Franklin, the preacher, not the Philadelphia printer. He was the editor of American Christian Review, originally supported the missionary societies, then later changed his view on that, spoke out against them. And I've read a certain amount of his writings and really appreciate him. You know, he was not a Southerner like Tolbert Fanning and David Lipscomb were, but he's one of those rare voices in the North that really had a lot of influence in a conservative sort of way. And I've really grown to appreciate some of the things he wrote, as well as I haven't read so much Tolbert Fanning, but David Lipscomb I have read some and appreciate what he has to say as well. J.W. McGarvey, generally conservative, but he did fudge on the Missionary Society. So he lived into the early 1900s. I think he died in, I don't remember, 1910 or 12, but very influential in the second half of the 19th century, and very respected scholar and preacher. Taught at the Bible department of Kentucky University that was dominated by these restoration-minded preachers. Eventually, there's a split between Kentucky University and the College of the Bible, and so it became a separate institution eventually, and you have a lot of the same cast of characters teaching there, and you know, people like Moses E. Lard, Isaiah Grubbs, J.W. McGarvey, and others. And this group of people generally accepted missionary societies, but were opposed to instrumental music, and they were generally conservative, but they really fudged on the other issue, and I think it cost them a lot of influence, in my opinion. But on the other side of the aisle, one of the most famous preachers, second half of the 19th century, that was really a promoter of this new bandwagon, editor of the Christian Standard, Isaac Errett. He encouraged missionary societies and instrumental music, and he poked fun at those who opposed these things and accused them of being backward and not with the spirit of the times. Drawing lines that God had not drawn, and so on and so forth. You know the routine. So he vehemently opposed the conservatives, and he paved the way. Even though, you know, I think in fairness, he was probably a whole lot more conservative than some of his descendants became in the Disciples of Christ Christian churches that became a very liberal institution by the early 1900s. I think he was probably more conservative, but he paved the way for them. He basically was one of the key players that opened the door and there was no stopping it once the door opened. And so you have different brotherhood papers like Gospel Advocate, American Christian Review, the Christian Standard, Large Quarterly, etc. Very popular and influential. In fact, someone said the Church of Christ has no bishops, only editors. And as this divisiveness began in the late 1800s, you have a lot of bickering, name calling, and fighting existing over these hot issues that were materializing. And very frankly, it got ugly. One conservative preacher was characterized as perverse and stubborn. He was regarded as a pest upon the body ecclesiastic and a millstone around the neck of the Reformation. And so Benjamin Franklin answers that charge. Wherein are we a millstone around the neck of the Reformation? In our decided and determined opposition to the departures being made from the primitive gospel, in our opposition to church fairs, festivals, church concerts, organ concerts, useless outlay of gorgeous and fashionable temples of folly and pride called churches, churches being the buildings, instruments of music, etc. We have sinned against Dr. Progress, Mrs. Fashion, Sir's Custom, and have thus become a millstone around the neck of pride, folly, arrogance, and self-importance in general, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life in general. We have failed to appreciate church fairs, festivals, and entertainments as a means of raising money for the Lord. We are opposed to no man, but opposed to all departures from the faith. And he wrote that in 1872. It is really provoking to think so many propositions for the adoption of means and practices intended to popularize our religious movement and break down these distinctions between us and the other denominations, which have to some degree united them in opposition to us, should be so stupidly and perversely opposed. In other words, you're opposing the very plank that has united us against all of this nonsense now that you're joining the party. So I'll end on this note, and we'll pick it up here next time. You have, among other things, a trend toward fashionable church buildings. In 1872, the Central Christian Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, spent $140,000 on a new building. That was a lot of money in those days. It would be comparable to many, many millions of dollars today, and tens of millions. $8,000 on a new organ. Benjamin Franklin, the preacher, attacked the church for appealing to the worldly, carnal, and pride in human hearts. Isaac Errett responded by saying that such a price naturally sounded high to a countryman. Another preacher said if the Pope should happen to visit Cincinnati and lose his way to the cathedral, he might sit pretty comfortably in Central and take notes of the advancement of his religious institutions. And again, you have a lot of barbs, but this is that church building. It's a monstrosity, and it opened in 1872, had a grand organ concert for the benefit of the Ladies Furnishing Committee, charging $1 a piece, which again was a lot of money in those days. And so we're getting started here. We'll finish this lesson next week, and then get into the early 20th century. So I'm gonna pause it right there, and we'll continue next week. Again, I'm hoping that there are some lessons here, and you have a little bit of perspective, or if you don't know these things, that gain a little perspective of how things happen the way they did. And by the time the dust clears, you have the Disciples of Christ, very liberal, mainstream Protestant denomination, ultra liberal. You have an independent Christian churches in the middle of things, and then you have those poor minority groups called Churches of Christ, predominantly in the South and the Midwest. And we'll talk about that next week and what happens into the 20th century as the dust clears with all of this. And it replicates itself all over again in the mid 20th century, unfortunately. And so we'll get there either next week or the week time after that. Okay, insights, questions, comments? Anybody would like to add anything? No? Okay, I'll let you go. You guys did a great job in our meeting. We appreciate it greatly. Appreciate it very much. And appreciate bringing all your folks over when we had a lot of Miller people on Thursday night. We had a lot of East Foothill people on Friday night, and we had a lot of Almaden Valley people on Sunday night, and people from other churches every night. But especially those nights, you had some local folks follow you over, so we appreciate that. But it was a very good meeting for us all in all, and we had a lot of non-Christians there actually. So appreciate the good job that you did. Okay, y'all have a good day. We'll see you next week, Lord willing.
Thank you, Mike.